Shalom, Holy Blossom. It is difficult to watch the dismantling of the so-called Freedom Convoy. After 3 weeks of demonstrations, after the Capitol's core has been debilitated by gridlock and head-splitting horns, today the massive trucks are being hauled off-site and demonstrators are being arrested in what the Globe and Mail is calling the largest law enforcement operation in Canadian history. Protesters are lying down in the snow or with zip ties on their wrists. They ask the police, "Is this what freedom looks like?" The right to protest is a hallmark of any democracy. For more than 150 years, North American Jews were often at the forefront of demonstrations of one kind or another, and so we must protect and defend the right to lawful protest. This week's Torah portion has a lot to say about freedom. Parashat Ki Tisa clarifies the Jewish definition of freedom. Remember, by now we have walked out on Pharaoh and the taskmasters. We have walked out on bricks and back-breaking slave labor. We have crossed the sea and celebrated our newfound freedom. We have stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, received the law, and what do we do with those wide open spaces of the wilderness? What do we do with all that freedom? We build the golden calf. And this is a twisted misuse of freedom, a misunderstanding of what freedom is for. So much so, it's often referred to as the original sin of the Jewish people. Building the golden calf was the breach. It was the breaking point, that unlawful and reckless act which perverted and abused our God-given freedom. In this week's parsha, we are taught that the Jewish definition of freedom is bound up with the law always. In fact, that period of 49 days when we were traveling from the shores of the sea to the foot of the mountain, we were not really yet free. We were only no longer slaves. Our freedom was not affirmed, our freedom was not made complete or whole until we received the law and committed fully to the law. That was the moment when we became Avdei Adonai, servants of the divine, servants to a sacred task, servants to being those who uphold the covenant of the law. In the 1960s, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote a lot about freedom, and a series of essays was bound together in a book entitled The Insecurity of Freedom. There he writes, freedom means more than mere emancipation. It is primarily freedom of conscience bound up with inner allegiance. The danger begins when freedom is thought to consist of the fact that, quote, I can act as I desire. That's when the danger begins. This definition not only overlooks the compulsions which often lie behind our desires, it reveals the tragic truth that freedom may develop within itself the seed of its own destruction. And remember, Rabbi Heschel writes in the aftermath and as a personal victim of Nazi tyranny. We too have caught glimpses of the seed of destruction. Recently in Ottawa, in Toronto, and other cities across the country, we saw it in Nazi flags waving and Confederate flags waving, in Canadian flags waving while turned upside down, calling for a dismantling of government. The seeds of our own destruction. Heschel continues, to be what one wants to be is also not freedom, since the wishes of the ego are largely determined by external factors. Freedom presupposes the capacity for sacrifice. And here Heschel is pointing to a shared responsibility. When an individual freely forfeits some of his own freedoms for the sake of the greater good. Here Heschel teaches us how the individual best expresses one's freedom when concerning oneself with the needs of the collective. In today's context, we can say that can be expressed by wearing masks, by honoring vaccine mandates, and throughout time, mitzvot of all kinds, to look out for the other. Each one has a responsibility to the whole. Heschel writes, man's true fulfillment cannot be reached by the isolated individual, and his true good depends on communion with and participation in that which transcends him. The glory of a free society lies not only in the consciousness of my own right to be free and my own capacity to be free, but also in the realization of my fellow human beings' right to be free, my fellow citizens' capacity to be free. And finally, Heschel says, in a final challenge to us today, the issue we face is how to save a person's belief in their capacity to be free. How will we save Canada's belief in our own capacity to be free? Remarkably, this question is being asked again today from coast to coast to coast, and south of the border as well, to be sure. How will we define our belief and our commitment to the capacity of freedom? Let us prepare to ask that question, and let us prepare to answer that question. This Shabbat, we will lift up the Kiddush cup, offer Kiddush, which includes words of sanctifying Shabbat when we enjoy our freedoms and we remember Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. We remember the Exodus from Egypt. We remember that we weren't always free. And we remember that freedom is fragile. So let us ask this question, this challenge from Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was so devoted to freedom of all humanity. What is our belief in our capacity to be free as Canadians today? And with that, I wish you a Shabbat Shalom.